pakai truk at ban.
Is the sound working?
Working great. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I am just quickly admitting folks from the waiting room. Love that you guys all came on today to hear from Superintendent Chris Reykdal. I'm going to put myself on mute for a couple of seconds. We have some Zoom keeping stuff that we want to talk to you about. A lot of it will be in the chat, so please go ahead and check into that if you haven't already. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone.
Hi, everybody. We have, oh, this is so exciting, so many people. It looks like we have about 130 people just logging in. I wanted to introduce myself really quickly. My name is Sharon Navas. I do not play the guitars that you see in the back of my Zoom. Those are my husband's. Please do not ask me to play you a little ditty. I am not very good at that. I did want to welcome Superintendent Reykdal to meeting with us. A few things I wanted to let everybody know. I will have everybody on mute today. So if you do have a question, please drop it in the chat. I will be asking Superintendent Reykdal those questions as they come up. Please don't feel shy. Looking forward to all of your questions. Currently, we have about 140 participants, which is great. In the chat, I'm about to drop a web link. If you are hard of hearing or deaf or need to visualize what's being said, the link that I just put into the chat is actually a live transcription of what's actually being said real time. So you will be able to read what's being said. With that, I want to welcome everybody. We're getting to about 150 people, which is great. This is being recorded, so we will be putting this up on our YouTube channel by the end of the day. Hi, everybody from Quinault, Ocean Beach, Renton, Ferndale, Tahoma. Oh my God, you guys. We are totally doing this statewide, so this is great. Thank you so much. Hey, Federal Way, what's up? So I'm going to actually kick it over to Superintendent Reykdal to say a couple of words. And then again, if you have any questions, put it in the chat. I know I have a bunch of questions, so let's keep going. Superintendent Reykdal, thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you, although virtually.
I don't hear you.
The world persists. Oh, that might be on your end. I am definitely unmuted. You can't hear me? Yeah, I just need a thumbs up out there if you actually can hear me. Awesome, great. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's
Okay,
good to see you.
technical difficulties. Oh, can you? I can't.
Yeah, I think everyone else has got me.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Technical difficulties on my end. Sorry.
Yeah, we were just together not too long ago, so I don't think that there's an enormous amount of change with respect to the planning that's going forward here, except that we clearly started up this back to school startup group. About 123 folks. I just did some calculating this morning. Definitely every region. 32 to 38 members of color out of that. Commissions represented community-based groups, principals, superintendents, students are on the group, teachers, parents. There's a whole expectation of those folks that to the best of their ability, they bring their personal lens, right, and their own lived experience, and to the best of their ability to represent the work of the group back out. I would remind everybody, just keep it on mute if you're not on. The challenge, of course, is the timeline. Districts really want information in the next 3 or 4 weeks that gives them a reasonable understanding of what their fall might look like. And I would remind you, the name of the group is, really reopening our schools. So the goal here is to open. The Department of Health will probably deliver most of the real regulatory stuff. They're the ones who will tell us about social distancing and hygiene practices. They'll tell us about how many students we can have on buses or in classrooms, and really those sort of elements that focus on health. And that will give districts a really good sense, I think, of what's possible from a health standpoint. Our job is to make sure that, to the best of our ability, we can describe a stable financial environment for districts next year. Obviously, the legislature controls that, but a good bit of our money, 96% or more of the appropriation to our public schools, is what we consider basic education. It really is formula driven, as prescribed by the legislature, and very protected under the state's paramount duty, because that's what the legislature effectively wrote to the court a year and a half, 2 years ago, when they said, hey, we've met your obligation and here's proof of all the investments we've made, and that's the basic ed box. The third part we have to do for districts is really build a menu of options for them to open. The open will look different than the close. The open will clearly reflect a lot more understanding about the incidence of the virus, its impact by population density, its risks to communities. So OMAC's going to look very different than Pullman. It's going to look different than Spokane or Bellingham or Seattle or Everett or Olympia or Port Angeles or Aberdeen. So we think coming out of this, good hygiene practices will be very consistent. How schools deploy could be quite different. That will be mostly a local decision for sure. And then we really have to give districts an understanding of their financial stability. Couple factoids to get us started, because I always want people grounded in the fact that this was a public health crisis first and foremost. It's become a challenge, of course, in every sector of the economy, and K-12 education, early learning, and higher ed are not immune from the risk that has been posed. But we're 4.5% of the world's population in the United States, but we're 28% of all the deaths. Our national approach to this, quite frankly, was insufficient. The testing was a failure with respect to preparing, even though we knew this was emerging in other countries and undoubtedly would become global. And we still do not have, in my opinion, or most experts' opinion on the subject, adequate testing to do the kind of rapid response understanding of the prevalence of the virus and then the subsequent contact tracing. So once you know somebody is infected, you want to quickly understand their contacts. This is how 5 or 6 nations that we are studying right now have been effective. They test aggressively, they know who gets infected, they then can mitigate that. And so they've had a much more successful open, including their schools. And so we're looking at nations around the world. We're looking at other states and what they might be planning. 42 out of the 50 states essentially are closed for the year. 53 million US school children are out of school for the rest of the year. So really no one's opening, but they've all got decent plans, or they're thinking about plans. The good news is Washington has fared better. We took action early and aggressively, both in education and in our larger economy. We're about 2.3 or 2.4% of the US population, but we are only about 1.1% of all the deaths in the United States. It's too many, right? It's still 1,000 of our neighbors, and mostly grandparents and great-grandparents, But relative to other population densities in the country, and certainly relative to other state populations, we have about half the incidence rate of other states. There are states who have done a really good job from the analytics, and others obviously who just had a remarkable explosion of cases and struggled to contain them. The northeast part of the United States is most impacted given their density, but you see pockets in Louisiana, Mississippi, Colorado, and Michigan, for example. Those are states who have high incidences of cases and deaths relative to their population density. So, you know, it's beginning to emerge that there are places that did a better job than others. So I know you're here for an education conversation, but it is really a dishonor to anyone to talk about how schools respond without always putting it in the context of public health and life and safety. So I wanted you to kind of be grounded in that. My summary is, as a nation, we did not fare well. Federal leadership was very poor on this. Our state, however, and a couple of our peer states have done quite a good job, relatively speaking. And now our goal is, you know, how do we get to a fall start that is safe and healthy and more effective as we move forward. So that's my update for you all. And I think the Q&A is probably the most informative way to get your questions answered and impart on me some information you want me to have.
Superintendent Reykdal, can you talk a little bit more about the reopening task force that was just put together, what you envision for that work group, and you know, how just what you envision for it?
Yeah, so a lot of states are cranking these up. They're trying to get a pretty good handle both on the epidemiology around models that may or may not be successful. And obviously they are also dependent on their respective health departments in their states. So we want to pull all that together and try to deliver something by early June. The goal is lots of voices, mostly to have people help us understand their experience so far. If some of the models are back to online or hybrid models, then we have to know where the gaps were. We are collecting some data from districts that's meaningful. We are getting a better handle on who had devices and who had connectivity. We're getting a better idea on how they deployed their learning strategies and how they deployed grading systems and all of that. But it's limited. There's only so much you can do in data collection. We also needed voices at the table to really say, hey, I am a parent and it has been a nightmare to try to navigate, you know, my kids through 3 or 4 or 5 different learning platforms across, you know, 1 or 2 different schools. And so we really want the candor of that to be a part of what other people experience. But it's a short timeline. So a lot of the work is done in subgroups and they'll really take off in earnest next week. They're very technical groups. How do you run transportation systems? And what do we do to make sure that we count enrollments? How do we make sure that the money and cash flow continues to work for districts? Then there are groups that will be much more about teaching and learning. What does delivery look like? What does connectivity look like? What does grading look like? How do we keep moving towards standards? There will be lots and lots of deeper dives on this. And, you know, almost everyone will engage in a smaller group, but with 123, of course, it's not possible to necessarily get everybody assigned to those. Our policymakers are on it. So that's mostly legislators, State Board of Ed, PESB, our Education Standards Board, and others. They will also have a role to kind of peel off and take a deeper dive into all the policy implications for what's emerging. They've got a big lift ahead of them, not just in the budget, but in a world that focuses on standards and trying to close gaps. You got to rethink testing systems. You got to rethink instructional models. You have to rethink how to drive resources to communities that need it the most. And they've got a lot on their plate. And we've tried to deliver a lot of hard contemplations for our lawmakers in the process, and it will get harder for them, I think.
Last time we spoke, we had a very quick conversation about standards and testing. I'm wondering if there's anything that community-based organizations and communities throughout the state can do to push back on whether we should relax the standards or at least try to open up and be innovative about what our children are learning, seeing as how this is probably going to be a longer term crisis than just the 8 weeks that we've been asked to stay at home, stay healthy.
Yeah, it's a really powerful question, Sharon. And as so many of you on this call, this webinar know, it's such a complex environment. If each state could really control its own assessment systems, again, what goes into it and how we do it and the frequency, I think we'd have the ability to move very quickly to something that makes a lot more sense. Being much more culturally responsive to knowing how students learn, how they demonstrate their knowledge. And I know that's where I think systems want to go, and that's what we really need advocacy for, is to push in that direction. Our challenge is we are anchored by a federal government who heretofore has only given us a waiver on the assessments that they mandate for this year, and there's just a big unknown for next year. And if they don't offer that waiver again, we're back to testing every single student in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and then once in high school, we've chosen 10th grade. All of that in math and in English language arts, and then 3 times in science. And so we're right back into the testing regime that is already fraught with some risk of inequity for sure, and a lack of responsiveness in the way it's designed. You double down the fact that so many of our students have missed some direct instructional time this spring. It doesn't set up for a very meaningful system of assessment next year. What I would say, though, is the goal here is not to get rid of assessments or standards. It's to double down on learning standards, and it's to double down on how students can express their understanding of knowledge and skills, but not necessarily be anchored to something that may produce very, very useless outputs. We may not know anything if we test in the traditional way next year, and it's obviously very expensive to do. Hundreds of millions of dollars around the country. So big unknown with the feds right now.
Okay. Is there a conversation at OSPI and the State Board of Ed and PESB around transitioning to a mastery type program over just meeting the testing and standards type process?
Yeah, the State Board of Education got the assignment from the legislature, might be now a year and a half ago, to really look at mastery-based education. It goes by a lot of different names, and really they're the best. I would definitely challenge you to sort of maybe meet with them to see what progress they've made on that. We have some people who participate, but the State Board of Ed who leads it. It's trying to get at this question of how do we demonstrate through more effective means what students know and can demonstrate. And it's trying to challenge systems that say, oh, it's about all kinds of seat time, or just a certain number of days, or just a certain number of tests. There are lots of ways that our students learn and can demonstrate their ability. And there are a lot of skills and talents our kids have that aren't on standardized tests. And competency-based systems attempt to try to capture that. And they try to, quite frankly, get rid of time as necessarily the only thing that matters to us. What if a student has total mastery of a content area after 90 days instead of 180? What if a student comes into a class and has been so advanced that they already have those skills? Can they get credit for that class, or do they just have to sit through it? Because that's what we do. Everyone takes that class. That's what it attempts to do. And I know they're trying to make progress, but boy, this COVID thing has hit hard for everybody. And I don't know the kind of status of where they are, but it's got great promise if it's done well.
A question from the chat. Will there be distance learning options for fall for children that are immunosuppressed?
Yeah, I'm really confident that we'll be able to provide that. Again, where this group will have to land is on options for districts, and they'll have to think about what a full open looks like, a hybrid open. What does it look like for students who have compromised immune systems, or who, frankly, their families just say, I don't feel safe going back no matter what's in place? So I think we're prepared to make clear that those options need to be available. It is such a hard contemplation because you're parallel building a back to school system that probably has more added costs, not less, if you're having to socially distance and not put as many kids on a bus. And then at the same time, you're building a system that says, and we want to make available continuous learning for students who need to stay home or want to stay home. This is going to be really, really tough financially. So we will build that menu and that expectation and that understanding. We have teachers and staff in the same position, right? They meet an age threshold, which is kind of rudimentary, but the bottom line for some of them is they too have health risks, and they're going to want options as well. So mirroring all that up and finding solution in it is something we can build as a bit of a framework, and then give districts all summer to really figure out the detail.
Another question is, I'm a special education teacher in a rural and physically isolated area. I'm looking for guidance on how to best serve my severely impacted students who need physical assistance with a one-to-one on their school day.
Yeah. Well, it's not going to happen through June 19th based on the governor's closure order, but that's why we're trying to get answers from him for what's possible after the 19th. And I really feel like we'll be in a position to open up our buildings this summer a bit for some of that intensive work, making up compensatory time and really trying to dive into an understanding of where gaps were exacerbated. And then we obviously want to open this fall. Our goal is to get back to that place where we can have those really powerful one-on-one supports and therapies where necessary. So the goal here is not how to make distance learning work better, although we want to be good at it. Our goal is to get back to school in a way that is safe and healthy. So that's going to involve PPE, and it's going to involve a lot of safety protocols. And again, the option in some communities may not be there like it will be in others, depending on how the governor and the Department of Health determine the risks.
Also, do you know if OSPI will set up clear guidelines for high school students that would prefer to get a GED rather than return to public school under CDC guidelines?
Well, that system is in place already, and what we'll have to do is partner really with our community-based partners and the community technical college system, who has a large role in that. So I think you're going to see a lot of students want options. Some GED, I think a lot of them will choose to want more dual credit options. Maybe they are junior, senior, and they weren't thinking about running START or something. They'll want it. Some of them will want to go to some of our online virtual academies as well. So I think those systems are pretty well in place, and it's a matter of letting students know their options and choices, and then giving them good guidance in those directions.
Are school districts publishing and analyzing disaggregated data by ethnicity in the weekly surveys submitted to OSPI?
I don't know if schools are doing that or not. We only ask for aggregate data on our end. They have it, of course, because they have student ID data, and would be collecting that locally. So everyone, as I've said so many times, you know, the most powerful relationships really on the ground in your local community. We collect aggregate data here, and we have a pretty good sense of connectivity and all that, meals, nutrition, childcare services, and all that. But no, we don't ask for student level data on that stuff. When we get to a more normal time, whatever that means, then we collect a lot of disaggregated data.
Okay. Could you talk to us about any guidance that OSPI has put forward in terms of cleaning, like the deep cleaning of the school buildings and school districts? I've spoken to some folks in our low-income areas that are afraid that it's going to be their kids or their teachers or paraeducators that are going to have to do a lot of the cleaning up and hand sanitizing and, you know, getting the disinfecting wipes and all of that. Is there already guidance from OSPI, or is that not under your purview?
Definitely not us, but there is guidance from the Department of Health, and I suspect they'll get, bad pun, they will scrub that guidance for this fall, knowing that they've got a lot more research under their belt about whether or not this is or isn't a higher risk on surfaces. So the Department of Health determines all of that. Labor and Industries determines some of this, particularly what does the employee have to have for either a skill set or protective equipment. So that's definitely not our world, but we share that and we link to it. This is why I say there's a huge bunch of information that has to come from health and L&I. It's the regulatory environment, and then school districts can figure out what options they have within that environment.
Do you anticipate, or could we talk about any negative blowback that might happen should parents decide to keep their kids at home and either do some kind of hybrid model or homeschool model? I think a lot of our families are really concerned about being immunosuppressed. And also as we're beginning to see all the data around race and ethnicity of those that are getting COVID and surviving COVID, the number of folks in communities of color is disastrous. And I think a lot of our kids, I know that a lot of my parents are concerned that their kids might be at higher risk because of things like lack of public health care and inability to have healthy options, and do you anticipate that schools will see negatively that if our parents are holding kids at home more often, if we have some kind of in-school situation in the fall?
Yeah, it's awfully hard to project what happens 4 months from now, but what we will not tolerate in guidance is anything that creates a punitive environment around that. Families in this state get choice. They get to go to school publicly. They've got charter school options. If it's a private school environment, money doesn't follow, of course. They pay out of pocket for that. But there are resources that can flow to homeschool families as well. And we've got a really robust homeschool community in this state. So our job is to make sure everyone understands their options for sure and to support them. I think maybe what you're getting at too a little bit is it's much more likely that in the Puget Sound, for example, it will be a hybrid model where students may get some face-to-face time and may get some learning at a distance. What about families who say, I'd rather just stay at a distance here, but I want connectivity and I want access, I want resources. And I know you get frustrated with my answer to this, but I will build the framework and the expectation for that. But at the end of the day, 99% of all the money in the state goes to a school district board who is elected in their community, and they decide how to deploy those dollars. So we will create the expectation of equity, collect that data. We will continue to know more and more about students, how they're being served, who's being served. And then districts, of course, have to make the difficult decision about how to deploy their limited resources. I think you're going to see quite a few options in the fall, but it's going to be really different. In communities that are very rural, who did not have these kinds of impacts, you're going to see them try to get back to face-to-face school, and they're going to try to do it in a very traditional way, more than likely. In places of high density and high risk are going to look a lot more hybrid and need a lot more options.
Okay. Superintendent Reykdal, I've gotten this question like 17 times dinged to me, so I have got to ask you, will OSPI create guidance on spending resources and best practices for accessing and delivering education for students of color and highly mobile students, including students experiencing homelessness, who are disproportionately students of color?
Yeah. So we do have some guidance about that now. Again, it tends to be helping districts understand the data, understand the risks, and understand access to their resources, whether they're community-based or particular things that we can invest in here. Our legislature doesn't actually appropriate any money based on race yet. A little bit of money for highly mobile populations, but as many of you know, there's a particular emphasis on learning assistance program, which has a pretty big menu. It is focused on low income and particular communities who need more supports. That's the kind of thing we would direct districts to and say, hey, out of this $400 million, you have significant flexibility here to focus on racial equity and to focus on disproportionality. That's what it is there for. Many of them kind of live in a world where they say, oh, I thought that money was only for early grade reading, which was how it kind of started many years ago, but it's been flexed up a lot since then. So we are constantly trying to remind our districts that they have quite a bit of ability to leverage those dollars and move them as they need to. They have to make those choices at the ground level. We will definitely have a better sense of the data going into the fall about the experience of our students by race, by gender, where we have that data, by geography, by grade band. So our districts are gonna know quite a bit more. Unfortunately, there's a lot we don't know, where they are collecting that data, and they know very, very well at the ground level what the experience has been, and we don't collect most of that. So some of our bigger districts have a real challenge here in how they're going to deploy.
Could you speak a little bit to the decision about grading recommendations? There's a question here that says, while local control is important, there are several options provided to districts, and we see them utilizing them as such. The asterisk on the report card doesn't really explain which districts choose to do an A or incomplete versus a true grading scale. The later challenge for our students applying to college, scholarships, apprenticeships, will prove very inequitable depending on what district you come from.
Maybe. The reason higher ed wanted the asterisk and the disclaimer is they understood they wanted to discount, if you will, what happens in this term. And for them, when they see a district give everybody A's, that is not going to necessarily be an advantage for those students.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be, because it will impact their GPA positively. Mostly what you're going to see is our higher ed institutions and scholarship programs, for example, who have increasingly walked away from the SAT and the ACT. They're looking at multiple variables for admissions and multiple variables to qualify students for programs. And they wanted to make sure that admissions counselors down the road knew how unusual this time was, because it could be 5 years later, and today's 8th grader taking an algebra class that counts for their high school transcript is then applying later on. So we did what we do at OSPI. We took a lot of feedback on this, and people said, we want action, but we don't want you to tell us what the grading system is. Just tighten down the menu, tighten it down a little bit so that we understand. We got rid of F's. We did not allow students to go backwards in their grades. We said incomplete is the option for those who couldn't demonstrate proficiency against standards, with an obligation for districts to support those students to do it. An incomplete, therefore, didn't impact the GPA. And we wanted every student to be in continuous learning. It does mean that like a dozen districts picked an A only or incomplete system, and almost every other district in the state picked an A through C or an A through D system. But higher ed knows who the AIs are, and I think people should be careful to presume that that has been an advantage for students at the next step.
Okay. Can we go back just for a couple of seconds to school funding? You know that this is my absolute favorite topic in the world, besides the equity conversation. You know, we have been looking at how the state funds the educational system for, I feel now it's been several decades. And I'm wondering if, you know, most people say that sometimes chaos is the best time to be innovative. And I'm wondering if now is a good time to really look at how we fund things in education, especially given that we don't have a weighted student formula. We don't fund on issues of race and like systems of oppression and living in low income areas. And we all, I think it's fair to say that we all know that the Learning Assistance Program is not funded to a level that would be sufficient for everyone in the school system. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to have a robust conversation around what we can do in terms of our funding structures. Maybe we do consider redefining what local control means. And I'm curious as to what you think about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is the time to do it. And, you know, I liked your intro, Sharon, because you said this gets you excited along with questions of equity and race. And as you well know, they're the same.
Right.
You can't how we fund schools from the injustice and the prior history of systemic racism. So I would say 100% the legislature controls this, right? I know people would love it if OSPI had the ability to send the money out based on formulas we create. I actually think we could create a pretty equitable system. Those are actually established by the legislature and their staff, so there's a funding model that they approve for us. I would say the evolution of the last 3 or 4 years has on balance been positive. So we went from a completely inequitable system of relying aggressively on local property values, right, which was the most inequitable system, to one where the gap was closed a lot in terms of funding. It's now effectively on a per student basis. It translates that way by the time you fund the prototypical school model. So there's less reliance on local levies and therefore less disparate results based on property values. The challenge, though, is it's not a progressive system yet. It doesn't send more money to communities who need it the most. In fact, it's a little regressive in that it sends more to those with high cost of living, which can be impactful. For those of you who live in the Puget Sound, interestingly, communities of color in the Puget Sound are quote unquote getting the benefit of high property values by the fact that the state now sends more money to them because they live in high property value areas. The exact same family with the exact same experiences and the exact same struggles living in a rural part of the state gets less money because they're not in a high property value area. So real good progress was made last time, but it did not flip to an equity focus. It flipped towards an equal focus. And the next sort of wave of innovation is an equity focus. How do you drive dollars to communities that need it the most? And if you follow Massachusetts at all, they would argue, interestingly, that the state should focus on that. It should drive its state dollars to communities that need it the most and let wealthier communities pay for their schools exclusively on their own through property taxes. That's what Massachusetts does. Struggling areas get lots of state money, and very wealthy suburbs around Boston, they pay for their schools completely out of their local property taxes. It's an idea, right? It's a concept, and there were people who pushed it 3 or 4 years ago. Our state determined not to. I think there were people worried about our Constitution. When it says paramount duty and it says, uniformity, I think people got pretty nervous about that. But to your point, sorry for the long answer, absolutely, it is always time to push this. There are innovative ideas out there that we don't have to reinvent. They exist, but the legislature would have to move another step beyond what they've already done to really focusing this question around equity. To your point, our federal title dollars are more equitable, our LAP dollars are more equitable, but that's about it.
I'm looking at the chat, and Superintendent Reykdal, we've got a ton of questions about digital equity and the digital divide. And I was wondering if you could, one, talk about the survey that OSPI has done. And then if you can, could you talk about what is there in terms of plan to start bringing some of that digital divide closer together so that we're not seeing so many students struggling through an online education system, but also how can we help both OSPI and I know the Department of Commerce is doing some broadband mapping. How can we help? Because these are our kids, our communities, and we want to make sure that information is getting to you.
Yeah. So this has been obviously one of the things that's always existed in the system. It is revealed when your only option to learn is at a distance. And so we have to see the good in the struggle, right? The good now is people can't ignore this. And it's obvious that somewhere in the 20 to 25% range on average across the state, students lack connectivity either because they don't have a device that's adequate or they don't have the connection, either a fixed line, so a cable to their home, or a wireless connection. Districts have been deploying devices and connections since this started, so we've closed the number of students who don't have that access. We're going to survey again next week on that. So in 2 weeks, we'll have a lot more data on where did we start in terms of connectivity on March 17th and where have we ended up in terms of students with adequate devices and connectivity, and how big is the gap? How many students still aren't there? Then you go into 2 spaces. Are they not connected because they don't physically have the option? They're rural, remote, and there's nothing there. Or they're sitting in the middle of the I-5 corridor with 5 different providers, but they can't afford the ridiculous prices that it sometimes costs to connect. We're trying to attack that right now, not waiting for next year. So you mentioned the deployment of hotspots, 100 hotspots, there'll be more, where we turn our internet at our schools inside out. It's a decent option, but it's not the best because you've got to get close to the school. So that relies on transportation, right? It creates its own challenges. It helps some students, but it won't be a solution for others. So we're trying to get into contract relationships, albeit very, very slow, but we want to purchase access for all students who are on free and reduced price lunch next year, who are in an area where they can get connectivity, but have not been able to afford the connection. And we think we can get to thousands and thousands of more students and guarantee them an opportunity at relatively decent speeds for the next year, assuming we're in this weird sort of hybrid on and off model. That gives us time to put pressure on the legislature, who ultimately will have to decide whether they want to make connectivity a part of basic ed. And I think it is time to make it a public utility, a public right. We would never say to students, well, we're going to charge everyone a different price for their textbooks depending on where you live and your family income. We just make it a part of a basic ed right. We buy textbooks, and we don't charge families for the heating bills in our schools. I mean, we have broad taxes that help do that. We make basic ed a particular expectation, and then we fund it. And it's time for connectivity to do the same thing. So can I make sure we grab the CDC recommendations, which I've seen pop up on the chat a lot?
Yeah.
Very, very quickly, the CDC, our federal friends, have a whole bunch of guidance, and the capital word being guidance. Not every state will do it that way, and we will do our best to make sure that we protect public health and safety, our student safety, and our staff. But there will be some things that are in their guidance that, again, are sort of best practices, but no state can reasonably do that. Hauling students on a bus so that it's only one student per seat and you skip every other seat means that you've tripled or quadrupled the cost of transportation from, say, $500 million a year to $2 billion a year to transport kids. That is unlikely to happen. So we got to figure out a way to do it safely, but it might mean relying more on some families who can bring their kids. It might mean different routes. There's really creative things we'll have to do. But for those of you reading the CDC guidelines, those are not mandates. They don't say in order to open schools, you must do this stuff. They're guidance, and our state will tailor those, as will all other states.
Has there been any conversation about more outdoor learning spaces that don't have the same restrictions on cleaning and working with community-based organizations that can support in this area?
So a little bit, because that group that's forming, we'll dive into some more of that next week. They'll be thinking about what the teaching and learning models look like, including some space issues. Boy, it'd sure be nice to be in San Diego right now thinking about this question, and not the Pacific Northwest with 6 months of rain, 44 inches of rain a year. Definitely a different opportunity for some states than others about this, but people definitely thinking about that, and what does it mean? How do you do it in a way that's obviously safe and healthy and constructive, right? But that's kind of the contemplation that group will go through. And again, none of this will be mandates. It will be guidance from us to the system. It'll be a menu of options for them. And I think people are already starting to think about some of that, including for some limited summer school opportunities.
Superintendent Reykdal, can you talk about students that have IEPs and or 504s and accommodations that they should be getting so that folks are aware of what they should be getting?
Yeah, well, every family who's a part of the process of developing an IEP or has a 504 plan, all the accommodations are subject to federal law, state law, and those have not been diminished at all. I think we talked about this last time. So those IEPs need to have an adherence, but they are, of course, coming in total conflict with social distancing mandates of the governor and the Department of Health. So where you need a particular therapy and a student can't get it because it just isn't reasonable at a distance right now on a two-dimensional screen miles away, it's not happening. It's just simply not happening. And it's not because anyone's wrong, it's because it can't be delivered. So the challenge here is who is engaging in IEP work to amend it relative to the environment we're in? Who's sticking with IEPs to say, hey, I'll take that as compensatory services, make up later. I want those services to come, but I get it, but I can't do it now. So I do expect those to happen this summer or this fall. I need the ability to engage in that. It's a very intimate relationship. It's a one-on-one sort of with the student's needs in that particular school and the IEP team. That is where it's best developed. What we do here is remind districts that there's no dilution, there's no change in federal requirements. There's nothing that they're getting out of. It's that they need to do the best they can at the distance model in place, and they need to document everything so that they can re-engage families when we have a better opportunity to deliver services in spaces and places that make a lot more sense. So that's where that sits right now. I know there are still states asking the feds to give them waivers, to change timelines, to diminish requirements. That's not the position that we've taken, but I'm guessing, based on what I read today, that maybe Florida is still pushing hard to do some of that work. And with this particular Department of Education, we get surprised pretty regularly by them. So we'll keep watching and seeing what comes of that. But our districts really know the challenges here, and so do the families. And our hope is we get clarification from the governor soon around what's possible this summer. And I think you could see some students coming in for very specific services by this summer to try to get them better prepared for the fall.
There are a couple of questions on the chat around equity and professional development and trying to, because we've closed, then, and I'm sure you know, there's a lot of conferences and PD that happens around equity and other issues that have been canceled. Is there any guidance on how to offer those conferences and clock hours and all that other stuff that we can bring back to our communities? And there's some school district folks on here. There's some teachers on here. What's the guidance on continuing education for our folks who are in education?
Well, I'll check with our team. I'm not sure we've issued guidance particularly on that. The Professional Educator Standards Board really drives all the policy around that. There are clock hour requirements still and certification requirements that move forward. Most of that, what is offered, is delivered by professional organizations in a content area or specialization. We do a little bit of that ourselves here. We've moved ours to virtual, still providing clock hours though, and our districts do, our ESDs do, we do. So I don't really expect a big disruption in those, but I think the volume of options is down, right? Everyone knows it's been harder to do, things got canceled. And in that regard, it might be a little harder for people to find opportunity and options. And then if there are budget reductions in the future, while I don't think the basic ed box is at risk, there are some things that are not in basic ed that are at risk. And so I think you can expect things to get pretty tight here financially for a couple of years around some of that stuff. So I think our educators need to be really focused on their professional development plans, be really intentional about what they need, and be pretty tactical about where you go to get that stuff. There'll probably be fewer options here.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up the budget, because the last question we have is pretty straightforward. Budget cuts. What can we expect?
Well, I wish I knew the details of what to expect. I can tell you what we advocate for. We remind policymakers and the governor that 96.5% of all the money they appropriate to schools is basic ed. It is constitutionally protected, in our opinion. We've run those numbers past their staff, and they don't really disagree with that. It means that some things like levy equalization and a few other buckets of money don't share that protection. But we are working hard to defend those because, as you've heard me say, I don't think the legislature amply funded a couple things like supports for students with disabilities. And I've guided districts to use levies and levy equalization to make up the difference. We do not want our students' civil rights compromised because of how we fund in this particular state. So given that I've made the legal case that is the paramount and foremost duty, is to serve our students with disabilities as part of basic ed, and I've said to districts, do by whatever means necessary, spend your money to do that, I get to go to the legislature and say, you can't cut levy equalization. You can't cut these other things, even though they're not in the box, because we've told districts they need it to do their basic education obligations. This next year, I think, is in pretty good shape. They're unlikely to change the budget a lot. They have a rainy day fund, and they've got some time to figure this out. I think the budget for 21-22 school year is harder, because this economic malaise may last longer. Theoretically, they'll burn through more of their emergency funds by then, and they'll either have to make hard choices on revenue or cuts to other places. And so I'm a lot more worried about 21-22 at this point. I think next year we're in really good shape. But please note that the ultimate decisions on how the money gets spent locally is a local decision. So I might deliver all that resource to districts, but they're gauging whether enrollments are dropping. They're gauging the risk of whether their levy passes. They're looking at their own cost systems and their own challenges, and they might make hard choices to start saving or start mitigating risk to avoid job losses down the road. And so we do our best to remind people that we're going to fight for all the resources at the state level. We don't think there's a short-term risk. We're going to defend rigorously what we get here. But at the end of the day, you got to have a local relationship. Local districts will decide their priorities, and right now some of them are making hard choices to reduce things in anticipation of things getting much worse over the next couple of years, and that is their opportunity. We just want them to have the best information about what's real in our eyes, what is a state risk versus a local choice.
Is there any anticipation that we're going to roll back some of the gains that we got with McCleary?
I don't think so. One of the interesting parts of the court 2.5 years ago was they told the legislature, hey, you can't cut a budget in education just to balance your budget.
Mm-hmm.
Once it's in the basic ed box, it's basic ed unless you can make a research case. You have to make a case that it is not an effective program or an effective investment in terms of student achievement. It's a pretty high bar, we think, for the legislature, so I don't expect to see any of that stuff roll back. But if it got bad enough, there's a path for them to do it. It's just very, very hard for them to do. I think there are other places they could cut for sure, that would be as effective for them and not violate the spirit of the court. And the way they do that is just freeze additional investments going forward, right? I mean, you can imagine them really locking down inflation factors going forward. And theoretically, those are in basic ed too, but if we have no inflation, if things are depressed and the economy goes backwards, it
Right.
means the legislature wouldn't have a additional cost in the future. And that's a better opportunity for them than trying to cut what we have.
Okay. Is there any plan, or have you thought of any, is it maybe rolling around in your head? How do we move forward as a public institution and look at things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, social emotional learning, some of the mental health issues that our kids are going to have? We hear from, it's ironic because we hear from some parents whose kids are really, really struggling through some mental health issues, as a lot of us are during the pandemic. And there are some families whose children's anxiety has gone down because they don't have to go through the rigmarole of the public school system. And I'm wondering if you, as our leader in education, are considering how do we revolutionize the educational system to look at our children in a holistic way that includes social emotional learning, mental health, and some of those basic needs that our kids are looking to really get taken care of during this thing.
Yeah, well, it's not a one-shot deal. It's a systems transformation. And I think the pendulum really maxed out a couple of years ago with trying to discount all of that and just say it's about a couple of core content areas. And if we just hammer those home and test on those, we'll all be better. And what we obviously learned is Maslow's hierarchy just rings true today. So taking care of those basic needs first and foremost builds the foundation for students to have traditional academic success. And hopefully you saw us out of the gate, with some controversy, say first and foremost, what you have to do is secure childcare for those who really need it. And you got to secure food for people. That's the first priority, schools, is that you got to make sure that students have nutrition. And we're delivering 300,000 meals a day right now in our schools, despite being closed. So we definitely believe in this framework. We've changed a lot of our mission here around this framework. We built guidance around mental health, and part of what this group will deliver is an expectation that the districts think a lot about that as they do, kind of jumpstart programs this summer and student evaluations, and as they think about their fall to go beyond academics. What do students need to have success? We got the first infusion of elementary school counselors of any significance for the first time in decades. And unfortunately, it fell victim to a veto, but I really like your point. We have been trying to make the point, and I think with some success, that you got to start turning that big ship and focusing on mental health and safety of kids, nutrition of kids, and connectivity. And then they thrive academically. They just have a much better opportunity. And I think our state's figuring that out quite a bit. And I'm heartened by the leadership in districts across the state. It's not just narrow in its geography. They all really do understand this. So we'll keep that priority. And I know we've got kind of a generation of lawmakers who have made this a much bigger priority. And I expect them to be back and pushing hard.
Superintendent Reykdal, we have 5 minutes left. Do you have any last thoughts that you want to leave us with, or any words of advice or hope?
I mean, the hope is that we, are going to defend our budgets and have an opportunity. The hope is that we still serve 1.1 million kids a year. And, we are a state that made some sacrifices to keep our hospitalizations down and our risks down. And we outperform the nation on that, but we still got to stay at it. If we want to get back to school where those better supports exist, again, they're not ideal, but they're better than what we do at a distance. We got to wash hands. We got to wear face masks. It's offensive to some people, but my goodness, we don't allow kids to come to school, you know, with open-toed shoes, and you got to dress, you know, you got to have clothes on. So a face mask is probably going to be a new accessory for the next year. And if that's what allows us to have school open, then that's what we have to do. So your advocacy around safety and health, first and foremost, creates the opportunity at student achievement. I like the idea of really pushing your policymakers where you know them locally on getting creative and flexible about resources. And I think everybody should really be doubling down on your relationship with your local district. We can build frameworks based on a set of values here that we gather from lots of community input and feedback. I'm 5 or 6 hours a day in either speaking mode or listening mode to communities, and we can build a framework of policy around that, but then local districts deploy it. They make those decisions. So all of you are very empowered when you are close to your local school boards. That's where you will see the most impact fastest.
Great. Superintendent Reykdal, thank you so much for spending an hour of your time. There are so many questions on the chat. I will send these to you so that we can have a more robust conversation. Maybe we'll have another conversation in a couple of weeks. Maybe I'll give you the month of June off. I don't know. I'll think about it. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to you, Superintendent. We really appreciate your leadership and your guidance on this. Folks, we will be putting our sign up website on the chat. Also, we will have this recording on our YouTube channel as well as the transcriptions. Please sign up for more information. We will be having more conversations like this with elected officials, our superintendent again. Please get involved with the EEC. Let us know what you're hearing in your communities, how we can help. Superintendent Reykdal said that the local relationships are super, super important. Let's get together. Let's work with your local officials, your school board members, and let's figure this out, because these are our kids. These are our communities. Thank you again. I look forward to talking to you guys soon. And just hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. We will definitely be talking to you guys soon. Thank you so much, and I hope you have an amazing day. Thank you, everybody.